Hi everyone, we're going to cover grammar and mechanics. You know, that's all my favorite. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with everything that, you need in order to be successful in terms of your writing. You always want to seem as though you are prepared, that you are educated, and that you pay attention to your writing. This is really what separates, kind of beginner writers and really advanced writers, I believe. So I'm going to cover 7 rules. I know it seems like a lot. Trust me when I say that I had about 40 that I wanted to start with. So I whittled it down to 7. So don't panic. I wanted to put them all on one slide for you just so that you could see them and kind of reference back to them for the future. This is a very simple one to learn, I think. Perhaps the simplest, but I just wanted to go over it. When we talk about first person pronouns, and second person pronouns. I know we talk about them all the time, but I just wanted to be sure that you're all clear about this. First person is when someone is talking about him or herself. So essentially, this is any reference to I or we, so singular and plural respectively, or when you say me or us. So this is saying like, I believe that, or I've experienced, we know that, or if you say this happened to me. Generally speaking, we do not ask you to write in first person unless we explicitly say so in things like journals or reflections or opinion pieces. But when you're writing a formal research paper, essentially, you should not ever be writing in first person. I also talk about second person down here because essentially it's just the word you. And under no circumstances in any situation should you write in the second person. What this tends to do is it minimizes your writing and it speaks directly to the reader. There are certain circumstances where someone might use them, but for your academic career in our criminal justice criminology program, you will not be writing in the second person. Again, this should also kind of be common sense for many, but sometimes it's not. I get that, we're very used to phones and computers correcting our writing. Be sure that you always capitalize I when it is appropriate for the writing task. I just told you that you shouldn't be using it that often, but if you do, always capitalize it. There's nothing worse than when a student turns in an assignment that's supposed to be short and a reflection, and they don't capitalize I. At the best, it seems really lazy, but at worst, it seems that you don't understand kind of basic rules of grammar. Always include proper names, right? So this includes states. States should be capitalized, any cities, people's formal names, and institutions like the Supreme Court, the New York Police Department. So anything formal and organized gets a capital letter at the beginning. Again, these are things you may not know, or sometimes you just don't think to catch them. And it's that you don't want to seem as though you're lazy. This is where we start to get a little bit hairy. Dependent clauses and independent clauses. I understand that many students don't take grammar anymore. So I'm just going to give you really simple questions or really simple examples about it. Essentially, a dependent clause cannot exist as a sentence on its own. This is essentially a fragment. The examples that I've given you when I was running, essentially, if it's you want more information after it because there's not enough explanation. Even though there are subjects and verbs in this, it still does not give you a full, complete picture of what's happening. An independent clause, on the other hand, can exist alone, right? The woman ran, the students studied. So there's specific situations when we combine some of these, but I just want to make sure that we have an understanding of the parts of sentences in general. So you can put a dependent and independent clause together. So for the first one here that I listed, when the student read the study, there's your dependent clause. Make sure it's followed by a comma. She understood that the research supported her hypothesis. Now, we could just leave this part of the sentence here, and that would be a complete and sufficient sentence, but we're adding more to it with the dependent clause. The important thing is that we're following it with a comma. However, when you have two independent clauses together, meaning two sentences that could be, or two clauses that could be sentences on their own, when you just put them together with a comma in the middle, that's when it becomes a run-on sentence. So essentially, when you combine them, you want to make sure that you add a comma with what we call conjunction. So either and or but, or you could separate it with a semicolon. This is a really interesting thing to notice in your writing. When we talk about tenses, we talk about present tense and past tense. There are multiple other ones, but I'm not going to get too crazy. Essentially, the present tense is speaking about now. So the example that I gave you, the research supports the notion. Present tense could also be something like the student walks to school. The student reads his assignments. Past tense is referring to things that happened obviously in the past. When you write though, you can choose either one, essentially depending on what's more logical, but pick one and use it consistently through your writing. So I've seen students that start a paragraph in the past tense saying that the United States has locked up or has incarcerated X amount of people. And then they kind of just switch into the present tense, when talking about the issues without really addressing the change. So just, it's something to notice, and something to be aware of. Rule 5 is just write literally. This happens, and when I point this out to students, like the light bulb kind of goes on, but I wanted to give you a few examples. First, there are certain, because the English language is ridiculous, there are certain examples of phrases that we say, but don't necessarily think about what they really mean. The most common one that I see is that students write, "This article looks at." I'm trying to get all of you to correct this to, "This article examines," "This article studies," because literally articles don't have eyes. They're not looking at anything. Don't use slang terms or language. So students say this or something like it, like the topic comes around every few years. Literally, it's not coming, and it's certainly not like around. It's just a silly language. So say something like "people discuss." So a lot of times when I correct papers, I'll underline things and I'll just write either colloquialism or I'll shorten it with COLL, so that you understand that this is not literal writing. The other example that I wanted to give was use more formal speech. So this makes you sound a little bit more polished. So instead of saying the United States locks up people, we want to say things like incarcerates people. So it looks like you have read and studied criminology rather than just gathering your opinions on social media. So examples that I gave you, they're also in kids. Obviously, we talk about kids a lot, but when you write about them, it's important to say things like children, juveniles, teenagers. Kids is slang. We talk of gets rid of, we could say eliminates instead. So if you look at just that, how we're not asking you to use big words all the time, but just to replace phrases with single words. Another thing that drives us all up the wall is when students say a lot. It's really unclear because we don't know exactly how many. In that sense, you could give an exact number or an estimate of it. But also my idea of a lot may not be your idea of a lot. So you want to be very clear. Students say thing, and that could really be anything. So be much more specific. People will write things like incarceration is a bad thing. Well, technically it's a practice, right? Or it's a policy, or it's a punishment deterrent. There are a lot of other words that you could use. Students have said things like messed up. Instead say, if you're saying like that practice is messed up, do you mean wrong? Do you mean that it's incorrect? Morally repugnant, something like, just be more specific. And then also again, writing literally when you say, if you want to say you looked up at something or you looked up information, literally, look up, think about what the words mean. You're not using your eyes to view something above you. Instead say researched or searched. Many of you know that this is my biggest pet peeve, and I will walk you through this very slowly. But there is active voice and there are passive voice. When it is possible, when we know who the subject of the sentence is, be sure that you start with it at the beginning of the sentence. Okay. So in the examples that I gave you, the research was conducted by the authors. Students, I think, like to write like this because it sounds a little bit fancier. Really what it sounds like is you're trying to add more words to take up more space, which I know is also a trick. Instead, if you look at this, the research, and the subject is the research here, and conducted, but the research itself is not conducting anything. In fact, the authors are conducting something. If you look, the main indicators of passive voice is that they all have this little helping verb in front of the verb. So it says was conducted, was shot, was read. And then it tells you who the actor is actually in this, what we call the prepositional phrase. So instead, we want to start with who's doing the action in each one. So over here, we want to say the authors conducted the research. It's much more concise and it's much clearer. You're not speaking in circles. The other thing that is important is that in criminal justice and criminology issues, we focus on responsibility, and passive voice removes the responsibility from the action. So in this example, when we say the woman was shot by the man, we're talking about the victim essentially and shot. Yes, there was a shooting, in fact, but we want to be clear about who did the shooting. So if you look at this, this makes very clear that it was the woman who shot the man. The same here. The paper was read by the professor. That sounds awkward and clunky. You can say the professor read the paper. The best way that you can avoid this is to not use the verb to be. So when you conjugate this, it's is, are, was, were, am, be, been. So any verb, any form of that, if you avoid that word, you will most likely avoid the passive voice. It's difficult, but it's a trick that you can try if you really, really want to improve your writing and your vocabulary. Lastly, you are growing up in a wonderful era where most of the machines and devices that you will use will tell you when you are wrong. I did not have this in high school or in college. And I think that this is an important feature that you need to learn. Generally speaking, if your document lights up like a Christmas tree, there is something wrong. So what I did was I gave you an example of just what I put into Microsoft Word and what it looked like. A lot of times it will correct it for you. For example, like this error right here, there versus there. It corrected it automatically. But somehow if it gets past it, it still highlights it. A major affect on communities, it should be effect with an E. That's also in the writing skills document for criminology that you should reference. You should capitalize Pennsylvania. And this is a run-on sentence. It even caught this run-on sentence for you. When you see these lines, right-click on them and see what the computer's trying to tell you. This is not even included in the rule. I'm telling you, this is a demand. This is coming down from Dr. Koshin, Dr. Jakimowski, Dr. Ankoviak, and God himself. Do not use contractions ever at all in anything that you ever write for us. We should never see an apostrophe in a word unless it's about possession. So essentially, any words like don't, can't, won't, shouldn't, should not be in your writing at all. Spell them out. Cannot, will not, should not. The only time it's even mildly acceptable is if it's in a direct quote that you're including in the writing, but even then, I don't like it. Let's just make this circle so that it gets through your head. All right. Things that I will tell you. We have a writing skills document for you that clarifies some of this. And we're going to provide a checklist so that before you turn in a paper to us, we want to see that you've gone and checked for many, many of these issues that we're discussing. Another thing is when you write a paper on your computer, you tend to only see what you've written and see what you mean. But rather, if you read it out loud, you catch some of the things that you missed or some mistakes. If you ask someone else to do the same, they'll catch even more. Everybody in the department, we love to recommend Grammarly. If you go online to Grammarly, you can upload your documents. They can scan them for you. They can even scan your web pages and see how your grammar looks. But proofread your work. Let the computer do it for you. The other thing is that your professors, all of us in the department, full-time faculty and adjuncts alike, spend an exorbitant amount of time providing you with feedback and editing your work. This is time consuming for us, but it's so that you learn. Go back and correct your errors and fix them and then learn from them so that you don't make them again. We want to see you grow as a writer and as a scholar through your 4 years. And then the last thing is practice. If you know that you don't understand the difference between affect and effect, go online and find out. That's why I gave you these references. These are a few tutorials about grammar, some things for academic writing in particular, and the website for Grammarly. You also know that I had to throw in a Notre Dame reference here for you, but they provided you with grammar assistance too. So that being said, good luck on the assessment. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. And I look forward to seeing all of you grow as writers. And don't ever use contractions.